Hi everyone, thank you for coming out. Happy spring, happy B Corp month. Happy to see you all. Lots of you know me, I'm Adam Garfunkel, I'm one of the co-owners, partners, and I serve as Chief Impact Officer at Junxion Strategy. We say our purpose is to accelerate the shift to the purpose economy, so you'll understand why I'm particularly interested in this conversation tonight. We are strategy and impact partners to companies that really want to make a difference, which means we help them articulate their purpose, plan for positive impact, and then measure and report on the difference they've made. Thank you. So this series of talks called the Be Ready talks, they're rooted in the 7 impact topics that the new B Corp standards, which come out next month in their final version, they're pretty final already, will come into effect next year. We thought we'd run a series of talks across the year to help us all be ready. I was just musing that many of you will know that these new standards have been 4 years in the creation, during which time I was reading today, Amy's former colleague James Vicaro at Triodos Bank posted that at the start of 2020, roughly when this process of revising the B Corp standards started, we had 400 gigatons of carbon budget left to give ourselves a pretty good chance of staying within 1.5 degrees of global heating, and we've used half of that up 4 years later. So, the B Corp standards, I'm not going to talk too much about them, but just to provide a little bit of framing for the conversation, there are going to be 7 new impact topics. You can think of them as 2 E's, 3 S's, and 2 G's, if that's helpful for you. Climate, action, and environmental stewardship and circularity. Those are your 2 E's. 3 S's, human rights, fair work, and justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the 2 G's are government affairs and collective action, and also, come in, sit. Government affairs and collective action, and of course, purpose and stakeholder governance, and that is where we're going to start today. Very briefly, the new standards are going to require companies to have a defined public purpose, companies that want to be B Corps, a defined public purpose contributing to a material positive impact for people and planet. They're going to have the highest governing body have an explicit oversight in monitoring the delivery of that purpose and their impacts on people and planet. They're going to have to consider impacts on stakeholders, and that's also going to be subject to oversight by the highest governing body. They're going to have to be transparent about their social and environmental performance and have adequate grievance procedures in place should stakeholders want to have a moan about things. So just to say, I've got a fantastic group of speakers. I'm going to hand over to Victoria in a minute to do a little bit of a keynote. Then we're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves, and then there's going to be some time for questions. And afterwards, there will be food out there from Greedy Vegan. Really good. So the people we've got for you tonight. Jonathan's here. Jonathan Wise from Purpose Disruptors has spent about a dozen years or so prodding and poking the advertising industry to acknowledge its role in our climate and nature crisis, following a more traditional career, I think you could say, as a brand planner. We have Charlotte Harrington, co-CEO of Belu Water, a social enterprise, 100% of profits go to WaterAid. She's been there for about 10 years as COO and now co-CEO, before which, again, I think also career in sort of more mainstream business. Amy, who has the vague job title of Corporate Projects Manager at Triodos Bank, where she's something of a sort of in-house entrepreneur, change maker. I noted she worked in food policy, and really interestingly, I think, as a licensing executive for Aardman Animations.
A very long time ago.
And Victoria Hurth, Pracademic, very involved in the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, spent time as a management consultant, I think, did a PhD in sustainable lifestyle marketing and behaviour change, and more recently, as I'm sure you all know, has been very involved in developing standards of governance around what it means to be a purpose-driven organisation. So I'm going to invite Victoria to share a few slides with us for about 7 or 8 minutes before we get into the discussion and then the Q&A. Victoria.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good to see you, everyone. Oh, I've got stage light. Oh, no, that's better. Right, so I have the challenge, excuse me, I'm just going to set my timer. The challenge of giving you something that we could spend days on, an overview in 7 minutes. I have done it before. It will be quick, it will be dense, but it doesn't matter. There are loads of resources out there. You can have these slides, by the way, use them as your own, pass them on. They are top level. This is what I think we all need to digest if we're really to understand what purpose is and its role in building a sustainable world. And if I've got something wrong, my fundamental question is, if it's not this, what is it? Because I really need to know. I don't want to be spending my time on something less than optimal. So, right, fundamental. We have set up our own economy with our market economy is designed with a set of very specific assumptions. Those assumptions are very clear, but they are hidden. And no one who's running countries or organizations today was born in a time that these were not the dominant assumptions. And they essentially say that citizens are self-interested and well-being motivated. They know what's in their own best interest. They know how to achieve it. The best way to achieve that is by buying that well-being on the marketplace. As long as organizations are operating in their own self-interest, and not worrying about our well-being, because maybe they might manipulate them, who knows, that they should only meet revealed preferences. That means that if organizations are making more money, they're obviously doing a brilliant job at meeting our revealed preferences, and therefore our well-being must be going up. And then there are a whole other series of connected assumptions, but the assumption of all assumptions is that financial income is a really amazing proxy for well-being outcomes. Therefore, and we're so certain of that we're not actually governing the goal. So, that's too long for me to spend 7 minutes on this, so I will be going quicker. What this means is that we count GDP at the macro level, we count profits at the organizational level, and that's not just business, that's all. And at our level, at an individual level, we focus on financially driven work and lives. And why wouldn't we? Because the money buys the well-being. We want governments to give us money in the pocket, that means raising GDP, and we want companies to make money to help with the financial situation of the country and to create jobs which create money so we can buy our well-being. And we're all in this nice trap, which makes it very moralized to have an economy that's essentially destroying us. If we want a market economy, and that's the first question, it's not left or right. I really think we need to go beyond that. This is about, do we want a market economy or do we want to be in command and control? Look what happened in the pandemic. It is not a far stretch that is where we will end up. We can say down with capitalism, what we mean is the form of capitalism that is killing us. What we need is a market economy that is designed to do what it always was. A well-being economy, purpose-driven organizations, and meaningful work and lives. Moving swiftly on, though, to get some of those foundations really in place. What is an economy? We cannot have a conversation about sustainability unless we really have that front of mind. It is about allocating resources that are available to us in a way that optimizes collective long-term well-being. That's economics 101. It's actually not very controversial. It is the foundation, really. Like, what's the point of an economy? It's that. So what is well-being? If the point of the economy is well-being, what is that? Well, it's obviously the oldest philosophical question, but we can think of it as a positive state of being where current and future needs are met, such that there is the capacity and opportunity to flourish. Basically, the good life, eudaimonia, it's an umbrella term. We can call it whatever we want. It doesn't matter. The point is, we're pretty clear that there's something and that we've been inquiring about for a very long time, and we call it well-being. And so then if we think about what sustainable development is, development that meets the needs satisfaction underpins well-being of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, then we can distill all of that to say that there is an objective that we are all working to. And if you ask enough whys around whether something is good or not good, you eventually get there, which is long-term well-being for all. So we talk about the pillars of sustainability, but pillars support something. What is the thing? Well, it's well-being, not any old thing. Let's keep debating what it is. Not for some people, for everyone, and not just now, but in the future. As a shared ethic. And if it's not that, what is it? But actually, if you look, that's everywhere. So Here we have the Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. We, as citizens, delegate to government to govern on our behalf. Even in a dictatorship, it is benignly being allowed to stay there. The primary function of governments and other public sector entities is to provide services that enhance or maintain the well-being of citizens and other eligible residents. And in our local authorities that are incorporated, their mandate, and they have ability to clear out all other things that get in their way, is to deliver well-being. So the goal of the economy should have been delivering well-being if it had been. So the goal of the economy, the definition of sustainability, and our meta-purpose are the same. If the economy had been doing what it's supposed to be doing, what we think it's doing, we wouldn't even need a word called sustainability. So the problem is not the economy, that's purpose-driven. The problem is how we have designed the economy. So where did we go wrong? So I'm just going to very briefly say governance, what matters is decision-making. Routine decision-making matters most. When people come together to do something as if they were one person, they are an organization. The governance of routine decision-making is therefore the thing that we really need to be focusing on more than anything else, because it's that which creates the impacts that are causing the problem. And there is a very important standard for you to look at, for ISO 37000, the very first international standard that has a definition of governance at all, that's applicable across the world, but also is not co-opted by the very economic system that is the problem. Definition of governance, I'm really going to go fast now. Direction, oversight, accountability, the foundations of governance. So you oversee your direction and you're accountable for it. All systems are governed, and all systems, in effect, have a governing body. So oversight and accountability are anchored to direction. What is direction? Well, it gets to the very heart of decision-making. It's made up of two key things. What are you trying to achieve as an optimizing goal? And what are the parameters within which you are doing that? That could be, I want a cup of tea, and my parameters are, I've got 5 minutes, no milk, up to our organization exists to do this within these parameters. And that matters because if you don't know your goal and your parameters, you cannot even start to talk about strategy, which is how do I achieve a goal within parameters, given the dynamic context that I face. So we cannot have strategic debate, strategic choice, unless we're clear about those goals and parameters. And very, very quickly, that leads us to the 3 logic framework that you can use to really get to the heart of why we're stuck, how we unstick, why the current solutions are not enough, and where purpose fits in. So given the assumptions about the economy, the business as usual economy, what that means in reality is that we have said organizations need to focus as their optimizing goal on their financial self-interest for all the reasons that I said. And we have also assumed that the most important capital to rely on in order to maximize financial income is stocks and flows of financial capital, and they're not the same thing. When we say profits are important, profits as an optimizing goal is not the same as having healthy stocks and flows that you need to run any organization for any optimizing goal. All organizations need an excess of financial capital and healthy stocks and flows to run any organization. Why this matters, of course, is because that delimits the strategy. So we're in a situation where we have hyper-grown, speeded up a market economy whose goal is self-interest, where decisions are made for self-interest with the long-term well-being for all of everyone out of the innovation picture, where we count the stocks of flows of financial capital and all the non-financial capitals, social and environmental systems, and stakeholder health are not in the decision-making parameters, which means you end up in an unsustainable world. Where else would you end up? And when the problems of that hit that system, because the only rational way to respond is if there is a business case for protecting or enhancing short-term financial self-interest, that is the only way in which you will act. And therefore, you end up with CSR and superficial action. And what we're trying to do is tell these companies that we have embedded in layers of governance system, we're trying to say, you ought to care about these other things. The fact that that governance system is set up to make that irrational just becomes a kind of highly tense sort of situation we're trying to manage. And these are the brick walls that the CSOs and everyone else is banging into. Okay, very, very quickly, those are off limits. This is where we have got to so far. Rather than questioning the fundamental assumptions of the market economy, instead we've said the problem is short-termism. That's not actually an assumption of the market economy, it's just a function of of institutionalizing greed, right? So you end up with saying, oh, hang a minute, rather than just placating these stakeholders and trying to keep them at bay, they're really shouting quite loudly now. Let's look down at the bottom of the triangle. Let's look to see what we are dependent on. Maybe there's something we should be thinking about. And you start to get enlightened organizations. So this is enlightened self-interest, and this is logic 2. And what that means, if you're really, most organizations are a bit enlightened some of the time, but it means that you would be bringing the health of all of these as a parameter for your decision making. Net zero is an example of a parameter that is trying to be put in, but there are many, many social and system breakdowns, social and environmental breakdowns that we know about, and B Corp is listing some of them. What that does, of course, is change the business case, so now you can divert capital away from shareholders or whatever else you might spend it on in order to protect the health at the bottom of the triangle. But, and that's ESG, by the way, and I don't have time to say anything about that. So this brings us to purpose. Because because purpose essentially changes the goal. It says that the organization exists not to make money in the hope that this market well-being machine pops out well-being, long-term well-being for all, but the organization exists as a strategic, optimal contribution to the goal of the economy. So really, it's just an efficient, effective economy. It is not just inefficient or ineffective to, instead of focusing on the goal, focus on a proxy for the goal and hope it works without governing. But the reality is that we have the science that tells us the opposite of the goal is being created. So all purpose does is correct the market economy to be highly efficient and highly effective, and that requires governance. It requires a different way of thinking about governance, and that is what we're building. And by the way, obviously, you also don't want to harm that at the same time. So having these parameters that protect the health at the same time, you don't exist to protect this health, but you want to protect this health while you do it. That is super critical. That gets confused all the time, and it really, really weighs down the ability of purpose-driven organizations to do what they do. I hope we have some time to go into that. So this is the British standard in purpose-driven organizations that sets out, leaning on ISO 37000, that thank God we now have, to say, what is the governance that's required for an organization that exists to optimize for long-term well-being for all and not destroy it? And that is the ultimate question. Ultimate question of humanity, of sustainability. Because if we can't answer that question, we might as well just not talk about having a sustainable world. And obviously purpose unleashes humanity back into the room and humanity's drive to serve the other. Again, massive point, 1 second. But this is what I'll end on, just to say that we are in the middle of up to 172 countries coming together to create an international standard that will reveal the current consensus on that destination, that then can be tested and learned, and more people can come to the co-creation table, because ISO is the best forum in the world for us to have as inclusive and co-creative a forum for defining what is the most important thing that we have to define, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. I appreciate there's lots more we could get into, and let's hope we get into that. And if you don't hear it, ask it. Jonathan, I'm going to come to you. We've heard that purpose-driven organisations are focused on this long-term well-being for all. And you've said in various ways over various years that the advertising industry kind of can't talk honestly about its contribution to overconsumption and climate change. It's firmly stuck in kind of logic 1 in Victoria's parlance. It's just financial capital is all it's thinking about. So how much is your work at Purpose Disruptors actually about getting individual people to reevaluate their personal purpose? How much is that the journey that we need to be going on here?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to Victoria just said something at the end, which is just struck a chord. You said it's about bringing humanity into the room, and it's interesting. I don't know if you saw yesterday. There's an organisation called Climate Whistleblower, and there was a lady, a woman called Paulina, who worked for Abbott Vickers BBDO, and she did a video saying that she'd been suspended and then left because she had called out the fact that they were working on Mars pet food and the plastic packaging situation there, and how ridiculous that was to be trying to sell that kind of product. And she basically, the idea in advertising in many companies is bring your whole self to work, bring your humanity into the room, and when you do that, you get fired. So it's a very interesting thing, the idea that the Logic 1 business model kind of claims that it wants to hear from people and claims that we want to hear all about you and bring your whole self to work. And when you bring your moral self to work, your love for your children, nieces and nephews in the future, the Brundtland definition here, that people in the future can live the life they want without being compromised, then that's not acceptable. And I find that a really fascinating insight into the way of business. The idea that, in my opinion, are we free? Do we live in a free and democratic country? Are we free and democratically able to speak our voice in a Logic 1 capitalistic system? And what I would say in the advertising industry, that's not the case, and that may be true in other industries. And so a lot of our work at Purpose Disruptors, so I worked in advertising, and I kind of did a master's program where I fundamentally realized that my job as a strategy person was to get people to buy more stuff. That's your job, that's the client brief. And yet, advertising drives consumption and consumption drives emissions. So basically, the better I did my job, the more damage I caused, right? In Logic 1, I'm absolutely a very valuable employee because I'm driving up growth and it's totally excluding the bottom of the triangle. Once you become aware of the bottom of the triangle, the sort of veil comes over and lifted, and you're like, what the hell am I doing? And so a lot of our work is like hosting pub nights, actually, where people come and sit in a circle with a pine cone and basically go, I don't know what to do. I cannot talk about this at work. I'm so grateful that you've created these spaces to meet other people who are just really confused. I love this job in advertising, but it's killing the planet, and I just don't know what to do. It's so interesting how rare it is to create spaces where people who work in business, in advertising in our case, can actually be honest about the limitations of Action 1 logic, because there's such a desire and a craving and a yearning to have conversations about who am I and what am I doing here.
And are you seeing any leaders in those advertising businesses come along to your pub nights?
A few, typically female women normally come, and some men. I think we do get some. We ran a summit last week with Kate Rayworth and Sophie Ho, and we got quite a few leaders there. And again, we did the pinecone thing. So it's a very complicated thing, I think. If you worked in an industry for 30 years, if you're a leader and your identity and your ego is bound on a Logic 1 success, I think it's very hard to kind of like acknowledge that might be something you might want to leave behind and question. It's very, very difficult.
I'm going to ask you to pass the mic to Charlotte, because you did leave that world behind. You were in that world for 15 years or more, and then you joined Belu Water 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I guess kind of where Jonathan's going, that was part of your journey to move from traditional business to a social enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, I think listening to Victoria speak actually is quite interesting. It sort of tracks my enlightenment, maybe. So I was very much in a kind of corporate business, in the buying teams of big supermarkets, and I felt that my values didn't align with where the business was going. So I was quite disillusioned, and I decided that I needed to do something else. I actually thought I was going on a career break to raise my kids, but then Belu approached me, and I didn't know anything about social enterprise at that point. And I think what was really interesting to me is that there was a bridge between a corporate business and charity. So I knew I could never work in a charity. I knew that wouldn't work with my skill sets. But I could use my commercial skills, but have a conscience. And that's what I took to Belu. So Belu, for those of you who don't know, is a drinks business. We're a social enterprise. We invest all of our profits into our purpose. Our purpose is to change the way the world sees water. And primarily to date, that has been the profits being passed to water aid. So we are very much in a purpose-focused environment, and everything that we do is around how do we demonstrate this business model is possible. So can you scale a business? Can you still have purpose at its heart? Can you demonstrate that it's measurable? Can you have good governance? And I could talk at length, but I won't take it all the time, but I can certainly touch on it later in some of the things that we've done to demonstrate that it is actually possible.
Great, thank you. Let's talk about talking about purpose. So, Amy, when we were chatting before, you said Triodos had a purpose before it had a banking license, which is kind of interesting. So you started, like, you didn't even have a ability to earn revenue before you had an idea about what the business stood for. So it's kind of another born good business.
Yeah, that's very much the case. So for anyone who doesn't know Triodos Bank, we're about 45 years old, started in the Netherlands, and we were founded by 4 finance people, bankers, who had been working in the industry a long time and recognised the fact that the finance sector had fundamentally disconnected the purpose of finance, which was to do things, and had just become about making money. It became about making money for money's sake rather than as a lubricant for society to make things happen. And so they didn't actually think Triodos would last very long, because they thought once the rest of the world saw that this was how they should be doing banking, everyone would go, that's brilliant. Unfortunately, 45 years later, well, maybe we're still going strong. But so essentially, the way that we work is purpose is the only reason we exist. We are there to finance things that have impact. So we have minimum standards on what lots of things that we won't finance, but those exclusions are not enough. Everybody who works at the bank, who goes out looking for people to lend money to, has to find additional impact in those projects. So they might be private sector, but they could also be social enterprises or charities. But they have to be able to demonstrate that they have an environmental, social, or cultural impact on top of being a financially viable project. So it's doing banking the way banking used to be done, where you would have a town and everyone with their savings in, and then people would come to the bank manager and say, I want to build a bigger bakery or start a bicycle factory or whatever it is, and the money that those people from that town had put in the bank was being used to invest. And it's essentially that on a bigger scale.
Oh, it's like It's a Wonderful Life.
You know, I've never seen them.
You've got to watch it every Christmas without fail.
Hunger Games now.
Yeah,
Hunger Games and It's a Wonderful Life. Excellent eclectic film recommendations from your outing from Bristol. Victoria, perhaps you'd like to just say something about the governance that is kind of implicit in here, because you just keep focusing on this idea that we're not structured correctly to deliver purpose.
Yeah, and we really, really all need to go on a journey of governance literacy. I'm not plugging the book, but I've been really immersed in trying to summarise all of this. And I hope it's a real start-off point, because it does require, I think, that kind of contemplation that you get with a book or a course. So I can say it like this, and maybe for some of you that makes sense. But governance is not about rules and regulations. Governance is the structure that should allow you to take away the rules and the structure. What we're doing is creating more and more and more rules that are drowning our organizations in bureaucracy and regulation, because we're trying to put holes in a sinking ship that is not fit for purpose, literally. And we will continue to do that unless we can understand what our goal and our parameters really are, put them in place, then we can clear out the rest, because we know that the decisions will be aligned to optimize for our long-term well-being for all, and will not be destroying that in the process. Then everything else is a strategic debate. And there's incredible work going on around strategy. But unless you have that governance direction clear, how can anyone say whether one strategy is better than the other? In relation to what? What? We're all talking across purposes. We haven't pinned it down. So how can we know? We can't. And the second thing that we we can't know is whether we're purpose washing or hushing. Because if we don't know what the destination looks like, we don't know. And that destination is never a product, a service, a thing. It will only be a way of routinely making decisions that loads the probability that that decision will optimize for our long-term well-being for all. That's the best we can ever achieve. There is no, and again, if there is, I've missed it, tell me, there is nothing better than that. So let's get on, define what it is, get that into other organizations. Now, the international standard, which we're writing now, will make clear, and it's wonderful to hear you speak. You know, you were talking about goal, parameters, getting that in, will really, more than PAS 828, the British standard, which you can look at, will really specify. What does that mean? What does it mean to set a parameter that will structure decision-making such that when you make that decision within that parameter, the healthy functioning of that stakeholder or that system, you will be doing a fair and adequate job towards. When you delimit and say, we're not going to invest in that, that's a hard parameter you're putting in. But yeah, so it's techie, but it's the simplest thing we can possibly do as well.
Thank you. Charlotte, I want to come to you and perhaps you can talk a little bit about the structures in place at Belu Water so that you do what you say you want to do.
Yeah, sure. So whether we've gone far enough or not, we can talk about later maybe. But we've recently restructured the business so that essentially we've been inspired by the Patagonia model. So our foundation, the Belu Foundation, wholly owns the Belu Limited Company. Alongside that, we have also written in the Sustainable Development Goals into the company articles. So that means that we can only ever exist to deliver against those. And we pull out 3 that are particularly pertinent to our business. But in essence, we support all of them. But we are a small business and we do not have a large reporting team. So we feel that it's most sensible to focus on the 3 where we can have the most cut through. So we absolutely champion those goals. But those 2 things we feel differentiate us in our organisational structure, but give us the governance to demonstrate that everything that we do is kind of traceable. We also have created a purpose P&L. So lots of people talk about an impact report, which we do publish, but we've created a P&L to demonstrate that actually the financial element is one part of it, but actually purpose is the first and most important thing. So we have a kind of very simple 4Ps framework, which is purpose first, and then it's about our products. Then it's about our people, then it's about our products, and then the profit is a kind of byproduct of all of that. And we try and bring it to life in this purpose P&L to demonstrate to all our stakeholders that there is a different way to go about doing business. But you need to make it visual and you need to make it accessible. And I guess that's what we've tried to do with this concept, is bring it to life and be really transparent. So, revenue does not equal the monies that we have left at the end of the day to deliver our impact. So some people assume that every pound that we receive goes to a water aid. That is not possible. We are a business. So it is taking people on a kind of educational journey, but it's also valuing some of the other KPIs that we should be measuring. So whether that's around carbon or other climate initiatives that we're supporting, or about gender equality. So there's lots of things within our purpose P&L that give us time. And I guess in bigger businesses, this is the ESG measurements. But to Victoria's point, that is tying up people with a lot of complexity and a lot of reporting. And a lot of them don't understand the data and do anything with it. And so for us, this is about keeping it simple, but actionable. And that's, I guess, the difference for us in some of the other reporting that we see in the marketplace. So we will always be open and very transparent.
So can I just come back to something you said about the SDGs? You've chosen 3 in particular. And Victoria, you talked about optimal strategic contribution to long-term well-being. So like the best we can do, but that's focused around what we've... So is that selection of 3 of the SDGs an example of being strategic in the contribution to long-term well-being?
Yes, in terms of the goal, yes. But what I would say, for that to be a really powerful decision-making purpose, the question would be, even if you have those 3, what sits on top of it that would actually be, as in the purpose... I can't remember who said it's logically impossible to optimize for more than one thing. So the question is, what is the thing you're optimizing for that those 3 help support, and then, which I'm sure you have. So but I'm just explaining. But there's a difference, and this is where people get confused with the SDGs. Most of the SDGs are targets for minimum conditions that we're trying to reach. Very, very few are what is going to optimize our long-term well-being for. They're expressions of parameters, like donut is. If you undo the donut, it is an expression of social and environmental threshold conditions that we want to meet as a minimum condition. That is a parameter. That is something that delimits what you do. But at the moment with ESG, we're trying to force into logic one the limitations to essentially profit maximizing, which is what is logical. But what we're really trying to do is say you cannot exist unless you can bring your business models into those thresholds. But we're not being clear about it. So then we say, oh, we have a goal of net zero and that's part of our purpose. And it's like, no, you're actually just transitioning. It's a goal to get a parameter in and stop doing harm and be able to get there. So this level, I really, really implore, because you are brilliant examples of the purpose-driven community. We need to get so much clearer and more sophisticated if we're going to do this. I mean, and time is running out. And this needs to be global, and there are people like you all over the world. So the ISO really is the forum for that. Do get involved, because this is not something on the side. I really do. This is what we need to do.
You talked, when we were talking before, about stakeholders and kind of differentiating between stakeholders, and they kind of get all lumped together. Like, we have stakeholders and a stakeholder economy, and we're considering impacts on stakeholders. And sure, most companies will go, well, we've got our people and we've got maybe our community, we might consider the environment. But you've been very clear in PAS 808, I believe, around kind of what you might think of as sort of rings of sort of spheres of influence or something, like there's an unpacking you can do to stakeholders that's helpful here.
Yeah, I think the key thing is, but when it's like when we say profits are important, stakeholders are important, value for all stakeholders, and I just go like alarm bells, because I'm like which stakeholders, for what thing are you trying, So what in PAS 808, and I'm pretty sure it will be in the ISO, is a classification that says when you have a certain purpose and that, or an objective like Logic 1, you essentially create a set of relationships around stakeholders, and there are 5 categories that we have there. And again, if we're missing anything, let us know. First, the ultimate stakeholders. That's everyone forever, because that's long-term well-being for all. And the first principle is to commit to that, because you don't want to create a purpose that ends up destroying that because it's out of date or whatever. So decisions are ultimately anchored to long-term well-being for all. The purpose that is in service of that, and that's the second stakeholder category. Who are the people who are in focus? We call them primary beneficiary stakeholders, or focal beneficiary stakeholders, we might call them, that who are implied or specifically made clear in your purpose. If your purpose is to solve climate change, that will also be the same as the ultimate, everyone forever. But if it's like refugees in your local area, they are the stakeholders that you are optimizing for. The third category is your influential stakeholders. Now, in ISO 37000 in governance, influential stakeholders are those that are legally or that you have deferred rights to influence you and your purpose and how you deliver it. So member stakeholders and reference stakeholders are the 2 categories. Member are shareholders. Or, if you're any kind of organization that has that legal structure, you'll have members. And then, and reference to those you defer rights to. Then you have enabling stakeholders. Now, that's what most people talk about, really. Certainly in the non-purpose world, if you look at stakeholderism and stakeholder capitalism, it's mostly been co-opted to be, well, and actually Ed Freeman, who I know well, is like, well, obviously you need to look after your stakeholders. Are you relying on them to deliver whatever you want? That's what he originally meant when he was talking about that. So those are your enabling stakeholders. Within all of these, there'll be subcategories, but those are the category. And the last one is affected stakeholders. Those who have no discernible impact on you, but who you impact, and therefore you need to understand. Now, and the first starting point is, if this is my purpose, who will my stakeholders be? Who will my influential stakeholders be? Is it possible to deliver that purpose? So stakeholders come in right at the start of the process. But if it is not about the obligations and expectations that you are creating by being an organization that exists to do X within Y parameters, then we're not moving forwards. It's just fluff.
There's a lot of fluff in this world. Okay, I want to just indulge me with a question about B Corps and are they really purpose-driven organisations or not? What strikes me in listening to you, Victoria, is there's a kind of inherent tension in the B Corp movement that many of us will have kind of explored and spoken to and read about, which is essentially that it includes both Logic 2 and Logic 3 entities.
And maybe some hidden Logic 1s.
And probably some hidden Logic 1s. And, like you could think of a business that might perhaps have long-term financial profit as its kind of thinking. So it's thinking about its enabling stakeholders, but it's all about profit at the end of the day. And you can think of other companies, my favourite B Corp might be Elvis and Cressy, who famously saw some London fire hose that was going to go to a landfill site, thought that's a great raw material, I can make beautiful bags and wallets with that. And no fire hose goes to landfill sites now because of her efforts. And that's why she started the business. So they're kind of very different starting points. So the tension in the movement seems to me is because it includes both Logic 2 and Logic 3 businesses. And I think there are plenty, therefore, that can't be purpose-driven in your
I know I've already said lots, but I'm just going to say, because it's really important. I am so happy that B Corp exists. My God, it has made a stamp in the world to say there is a different way of doing things. And look at you all here and your amazing businesses. But I always felt from the very beginning that in equal measure its benefit is its potential downfall, in that if it is implying that that is the destination, then it's holding us back. And so I've been this sort of bit of a thorn in the side to say, come on. Now, what I'd like to see, and I was involved in the
reframing.
I was consulted quite deeply on it, but how much ended up in there, But the point is, we need a broad church. We need people to feel that they can go on that journey. We need, however, it to be very clear what journey you're on, where is it going, how far will this journey take you? And I hope that one day, B Corp, one day soon, will take organisations all the way to ISO 3711. I don't think it will with the new, but even before that, there needs to be, and this would be my imploring also to you, is to say when ISO 3711 comes out, what can be done to help B Corp to be clearer about which logics and what behaviours would take you on that journey? Because this is not about saying to anyone, you're not good enough. It's a journey, and we're all on that journey, but we need to be clear where we are and how far away we are from that destination.
And certainly the B Corp movement would say it is a broad church, it doesn't expect perfect, it wants companies to be going on a journey, but you make a good point, which is perhaps that the destination isn't specified. But even then in the new standards where they're saying, okay, you're going to have to write down what your purpose is and how it relates to having material positive impact on people and planet, that's unlikely to be far enough.
Well, firstly, it's hybridity, right? We've set up hybridity. That's not purpose. That is a really difficult halfway house where you say you maximise for profit and purpose, and you somehow got to work out in your governance and decision making how that works, right? That has been torn down by so many people because it's almost impossible to do. I understand why it's necessary in the transition, but hey, let's understand that a better place lies beyond it, firstly. Secondly, it's great that they have oversight, but they have not nailed the direction, from what I can tell, and they have not nailed the accountability part, which means it's dabbling with governance, which is great because it's better than having nothing in there. But come on, an ISO 37000 lays out precisely, what it is to govern at the foundations. But once 3711's out, we can just go there. So yeah, I think we all need to be part of making B Corp that on-ramp, that real on-ramp, streamlined on-ramp, and certainly help it get out of where it is, which is being accused for purpose washing, which is a valid accusation, because like I said, if you don't know what the destination is and you can't nuance what you're saying in relation to it, you are purpose washing.
Amy, I'm going to put you on the spot as a representative B Corp company. I mean, I'm B Corp as well, but yes.
Okay.
Tell me how that lands for you.
All of that. That's a lot. I think it's really interesting. So I'm not sure this is quite where you're going with this, but as I was sitting and thinking about that, I was just thinking, what would it be like if there weren't any companies, let's just call them cynical, financially motivated companies, trying to become B Corps. Because actually, why do they? They do because they recognise that that's something that customers, consumers, stakeholders, however you want to think about it, want. At the point at which none of those companies want to be B Corp, I think B Corp loses some of its value. Like, I'm not saying we want them in, but we want them to want to be in. And that's a complicated thing to manage, because sometimes maybe that decision is not the right one. Sometimes companies that maybe shouldn't be get in. But maybe that's not the worst problem to have. I mean, obviously we have to be very careful from a reputational point of view. I mean, it's complicated, but I just think that maybe that's something to consider. I'm very interested to see what happens when the new standards come out. I think a lot of us have seen that there has been some anxiety recently, and some companies questioning whether or not it's doing what it needs to do. But I do feel like it's really important, and I'm really messing myself up here now, because I'm going to use my final takeaway point now.
Come on, let's have it now.
But I think we have to be really careful with B Corp. It's there for a very valuable purpose, and we as businesses, whether or not we are actually B Corps, we have to make sure we don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And to reference, some of you may know who Clover Hogan is, and she did a really good TED Talk recently. And to paraphrase her, we don't need 100 perfect B Corps. We need 1 million purpose-led businesses.
Doing it imperfectly. Because we can't, we can't try to make everyone do everything all the time. We're very hard on ourselves. So, okay.
I'm not sure.
That's great. No, works for me. I'm going to go to Charlotte.
So we're not a B Corp. We are a social enterprise, as I said earlier. We've looked at the framework, and we're in a controversial category. But there are many a big FMCG company in the controversial category who are B Corps. So we have conflicting feelings about it. I think, the idea of there being a framework that people can aspire to is a good thing. I think it's provoking people to think more deeply. I'll have a look at the new framework when it comes out. I will certainly look at the new international framework when it comes out. And I think it's a good challenge. It's a good benchmark for us to reflect on, to see whether what we're doing already is sufficient and whether it can push us further. So I think that in itself is useful. I'm not sure whether we would ever feel the need to become a B Corp in reality. I'm not sure it adds anything to us. I think at the moment, lots of people see it as a badge, for good or for bad. I think certainly in the markets where we compete, it's a sort of tick box exercise for some corporates. Are you a B Corp? Tick. Are you a social enterprise? Tick. So they're kind of not really appreciating what it really means, actually. So I think there's a long way to go from an educational perspective as well.
Thank you. Jonathan, back to you. I just want to start one difficult question. I'm going to leave it with you. So I don't know how to phrase this. The most upsetting, maybe for me, scene of the recent political landscape in the States has been the way we've seen business leaders kind of kowtow to this kind of super logic one, this sort of anticipatory obedience play, which Tim Snyder and others has pointed out is a very dangerous slippery slope. If that's what we're seeing as kind of corporate leadership, how the hell are we going to get those leaders on this journey to a totally different form of governance and worldview?
That's quite a big question.
I know. I thought I'd give you a biggie.
Yeah, that's $1 million question. I guess the way that we've been thinking about it is to kind of, and this may or may not, this is like emergent thinking, but it's like choose your battles. So I don't know if I can say this in public, but basically like we had some relations in America in terms of trying to make some change there. Personally, I'm like, let's just stop doing that. I just don't think that's going to work. I think that might be wasted time. yet. We're looking at which of the institutions which are going to have the leaders which are most likely to be unaffected by what's happening in the States. So in our work, that may be greenhouse gas protocol. Can we get our work on advertised emissions included within that as definition of scope 3? What we can do with the law? What can we do with other regulatory bodies? So what we've done is we're not answering that question because I think it's too volatile to work out who's going to stick and who's going to do the anticipatory kind of coercion thing. So we're kind of at the moment kind of going, where's that less likely to happen? And let's focus on those areas because the institutional gravitas and protection, hopefully, because they're non-corporate, may well be, and play with corporations in Europe as well. So just, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Victoria, I just want to throw that over to you. It's kind of thinking, you're developing an international standard, you're leading that process, great, but in this context, people are rowing in the opposite direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's logic one, isn't it? It makes sense. It's comfortable. It's what we know. And my son, 15-year-old son's like, well, obviously business is there to make as much money as possible. When you stare a different paradigm in the face, that is difficult unless you've gone on that journey. And when things get tough, we know that people will entrench. But what we fundamentally know is that the current system is killing us. Whether people can describe why, how, and what way, that is being felt. And many people are describing that what's going on in the US and elsewhere. I don't know if any saw the speech from the Argentinian president, but it is really please do watch the speech from the Argentinian Prime Minister because it exposes all of the spin and the narrative. And essentially it's saying anyone who is woke are those who are trying to uphold the establishment and trying to do command and control. So he's saying you want to lose your freedom and you want to have a command and control system, then you basically stay with the establishment. And there is no narrative that is on the other side, which is what I was presenting now. Logic 3 is that other narrative. We're in Logic 3, but we're just not coherently clear and crystal and confident enough to be able to say that that's what it is and that it is not. Because everyone's going, oh, that's a little bit too radical and different. It's like, yeah, it needs to be, not only in order to align with a sustainable future, but so that people realise there's something that isn't the establishment. Because what's happening over there is this isn't the establishment, therefore it's good, and what's the alternative? It's the establishment. So, and then last thing, in terms of unlocking those leaders, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but the power that it gives you when you can name the problem, when you can name Logic 1, when you can see how it manifests, when you can understand its conditions, for all the people in organisations just believing that the next CEO really means it, and then banging their head against the wall for it all to be rolled back, when if you took the analysis and you saw the governance, and this is why that really matters, don't believe any of this stuff. What is the governance system telling you is really what's happening at the organisation? Then you know what it is. Then make your decisions and navigate that strategically. So the power is in seeing these 3 logics and then owning 3.
And maybe the hopeful thing is we can see Logic 1 very clearly manifesting. And so it ought to drive people, help us with that clarity.
And Jane Davidson, the Welsh politician who's been at the heart of manifesting, because purpose-driven government is one of the key places we need to start. She said exactly that, because I interviewed her for the book, and she was like, this book's coming just at that time where people can look at that and go, wow, now I can see more clearly what's going on. And there's such power and confidence in that. And that's what we need. Individual leaders with the confidence to embody a future that doesn't yet exist. And that is a Logic 3 future. And yes, finally to say, yes, this is not about saying, if we don't know what perfect looks like, we don't know where we're heading. And one of the things I think that will kill us quickest is patting ourselves on the back because we've made something better. There's so much shit going on, it's easy to make something better. The question is, should our ambition have been there or should it have been there? And when it's there, my God, what might we achieve?
Thank you, great. So does any of the purpose-driven leaders wrestling with Logic 3 in the room want to ask a question of this fantastic panel? So the question I think is is there a blending or a sort of muddling of outcomes and process?
Yeah, no, so what you're describing there is the well-being machine, and that's why we buy into it, because the assumption is, so firstly, no one is governing whether or not those assumptions hold. So it's not like magic, that it is governed, it is specific, it is enacted because of assumptions. So that's the first thing. And then if we're saying that all we're doing is saying the economy is there to deliver long-term well-being for all, which I don't think anyone would disagree with, and it is the implicitly there, the question then is, well, how do we make sure it does that? And if every organisation is just defining its version, and what we would need, I don't have time to go into any of that detail, but let's imagine what and this is what the standard does, it allows us to imagine what would the world need to look like for that to be true? What would need to be different about law and finance and this, that, and the other? And that's work that I really hope will happen. And so the question then is, what would it need to constitute an organisation? In the past, kings and queens were, deigned whether something was worthwhile, right? So, and when you're a charity, you have to declare your, what is the benefit you're going to create and all the rest. So why shouldn't we have every organisation clearly saying what its optimal strategic contribution is to long-term well-being for all, a commitment to not destroying it in the process, some sense of how it can do that, and then it gets judged whether they have the right to access our precious shared and very degraded resources. And why would we want organisations to do anything else? So to me, it's just, yeah.
Come in.
Yeah, I was just thinking, sitting in the middle of it, what you're saying kind of implies that there aren't any preconditions. And I guess here we've got, but you've got the advertising industry, which when we say, you say, so in theory, the market does what the market naturally does. It will go in the right direction. But actually, you've got whole industries like the advertising industry who are overtly and covertly subverting it. And so we don't end up with a market which is the genuine natural market we would get. And I think that that's probably a really important part of it. So, yeah.
Critical, thank you.
Great point. Thank you. Any more questions? Yes. What is the stakeholder you're optimising for?
It really depends on the stakeholder. And there are objectives and subjective measures to well-being. So then we get into a whole field of well-being accounting and not just the accounting for it, but the doing of it. But it's the point that the question is, what is in their best interest? It would depend. You might have a purpose that already has assumed what is in their best interest, and you're saying you're delivering that. Now, in the purpose statement in the standard, you would need to justify that theory of change, So there are limitations, of course, which is why just one subjective, so some people say we should just ask people how they feel. And then that tells you, no, well, we know it's more than that. And like you say, it's been co-opted. So we have to recognise we don't know how to deliver. We have become devoid of really properly understanding what well-being is. Because it's not been a question in the centre of the room, because one of the effects of the market economy is saying we don't need to ask that question anymore because it pops out of the system. So let's not talk about such controversial things. My gosh, that started a war, remember? And I'm sure we've really stopped a whole load of wars because we haven't talked about these things, but we have created a much bigger problem. So yes, limitations and lots more to say on that. But.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add to that? I was just going to ask a follow-up question about the stakeholders we optimise for. Is that someone's come from an impact management background and where companies talk about beneficiaries?
That's a project, I found out just this morning that's specifically a project management language, because the Association of Project Managers uses the word beneficiaries, but that is they use that word and not impact, because you can define it, which your benefits could be to make more money.
Indeed, they could be. But I guess I was thinking in some terms, companies are asked if they're planning to have, they've got a vision of the world and they know their impact they want to have, and they can therefore track the outcomes for their beneficiaries over time, in theory. In that sense, then would those beneficiaries be the same as the stakeholders we're optimizing for?
Well, it depends how you're defining the term beneficiaries, but this is where, like, ultimate beneficiaries, stakeholder category 1, focal beneficiaries, those you're optimizing for. The others are those who are either effective or supporting or, what you're doing. But yes, those two first categories are about what you exist to optimize for.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Anyone else got a question? To anyone to... I've got a question for Charlotte and Amy, which is, it's not easy trying to have a purpose and live it. And I just wondered whether you had something you could share around, like a challenge you've found in trying to be true to your purpose and a way you've got past it or overcome it.
I think, I'm trying to think how best to answer that question. I think, we're lucky, I guess, because we were born with a purpose. So, we have always existed to challenge the kind of industry benchmark. I think when we are faced with dilemmas of how to live your purpose first, actually we have a really strong set of values that's sort of the DNA within the business that guide us. So I'm not sure if this is going to answer your question, but the one that jumps to mind is when it's very practical and kind of operational, because that is my background. But essentially, we use glass bottles. We manufacture those glass bottles in the UK because that obviously minimises the footprint of them. And suddenly, for reasons that you couldn't imagine, we could no longer buy them in the UK. So we were faced with the issue of trying to find these new glass bottles. This was about 80% of our revenue at the time, a bit like COVID. We really had to decide what to do. And the only option was for us to go and inspire and persuade other UK manufacturers. But for that, we had to pay a premium. And I guess that's, for me, what differentiates and demonstrates us living our purpose and our values in a way that my old company wouldn't have done that. We would have gone for the cheapest and we'd have said, fine, it's got to come from wherever, it doesn't matter. But actually for us, that was a non-negotiable. So we absolutely had to find a solution, and we will pay more to deliver the same product because that's the right way to do it. So giving people ways in which you can demonstrate this in real life, I think, is really, really important. And it's not all smooth sailing. You can't always inspire and persuade people. We were lucky, I think, on that occasion. But I think maybe that demonstrates how it's the heart of our business.
Great. And a sort of similar question for you. Financing change, changing finance, that's a lot to bite off.
It is.
You must have had some challenges in living that purpose.
Absolutely. Yes, I think it's interesting you just mentioned values, because we haven't really, but that was, I think, talking about us as a purpose-led business, that's quite new language, but we've always described ourselves as values-led or values-driven. One of our values is transparency, which is, I think we'll all agree, not the finance industry's strongest suit. And we publish on our website every loan, all the organisations that we lend to. So if you're a customer and you've got your savings or your ISA or your current account with Triodos, you can go on our website and you can see exactly what your money's being used for, which is great. But when you're values-led, you have a set of values that you have chosen are your values. And so I was talking about minimum standards, and there are a lot of things in there, things that we don't lend to, which you wouldn't be surprised by. We don't lend into anything to do with nuclear technology. We don't invest in fossil fuels. We won't invest in companies that do animal testing. Those kinds of things that I think we probably all say. But there are other areas. For example, we've financed organic farms for a very long time. A lot of organic farms are mixed farms. They function on being mixed farms, so they have animals as well as arable. We also support a number of vegan organisations. Sometimes people come to us because they like the fact we support vegan organisations, then they get angry because we're also financing organic dairy farming. One that's very live at the moment is we've always had an absolute precondition. We don't finance anything to do with arms. At the moment, you may have read, there are a number of conversations going on about whether or not pension funds should be excluding arms from ethical pension funds because of the current situation we have and whether or not that's the right thing to do. And what you end up with is everybody who feels that they are a values-led individual expecting you to have the exact same set of values that they do. And so that's a challenge, because we have to find a way, but not everybody's way is the same. So yeah, that is the downside of being transparent. You know, if you tell everybody exactly what you're doing, then they know exactly what you're doing, and they may or may not like it. But at least they know, and you can guarantee that if their money were elsewhere, they wouldn't know. So,
Jonathan, any final thoughts on transparency or any of this?
It's a fascinating thing. It's like how, because if you're in logic 1, obviously you don't need to make any of those decisions because money is amoral. If it makes money, it's good. And so like the leadership requirement there is actually pretty easy. All you got to do is do the thing that makes the most money. Once you start getting into the grey, that's really fascinating. So how do you make choices that, you know, what is the right choice? And sort of how do you decide how to decide is a really interesting kind of like question. You know, like there's an agency, Nice and Serious, Tom Tapper, Victoria knows, they have a thing called the moral compass. So when a brief comes into the agency, they ask everybody anonymously to decide whether or not this is a project they want to work on, whether the agency should work on it. And that's the democratic way to decide whether or not they accept the pitch or not. I think that kind of technology, that kind of democracy, I think is a really interesting way of like, yeah, it's a leadership question of how do you make decisions that lead to kind of logic 3 things, because that is really hard.
Really hard. We have a client selection policy because I like to think we choose our clients. They don't choose us. I think I'm going to end it there. Thank you all for coming out. There's going to be great food over there, thanks to the Greedy Vegan. So if you could all get up from here and go over there and scoff it and talk to each other, that would be fantastic. I always say that there are one of the main outcomes of getting together is sharing the challenges we all face and doing it in being in community with each other. So please enjoy each other's company over some food, and join me in thanking the speakers for an excellent evening.